Okay, let's wait for a couple of minutes, and I'll get started to see if anyone comes in late. Okay, so let's get started. We fell a little bit behind in the readings for the semester, which is normally happens with me. Maybe I'm slightly too ambitious with what I try and get in at the beginning of the semester. So today we're going to do a little kind of crash course in Tommasello. And as I said before, like the people I'm choosing to look at in this bit of the semester are people where I think there's interesting interactions between philosophers and non-philosophers, where we see the sort of how there can be useful interactions between disciplines. And so I take it that Tommasello is a psychologist, a linguist. I don't know. He does sort of psycholinguistics. So and I think he's very influenced by philosophy and has been very influential on philosophers. So who's read this article? I'm just wondering, the cooperation and human cognition, the Vygotskian intelligence hypothesis. And I assume you've all read it. Give me a hands up if you've read it. Okay, so I mean, half of you have. So Tommasello his earlier work is on language development and about the emergence of language. He has a sort of pragmatics first approach. He was based in Dresden. He kind of worked with the chimpanzees there, and so I think a lot of his most interesting work is sort of comparative work between humans and chimpanzees. I think one of the problems with Tommasello, so one of the sort of objections to Tommasello, is that he's an experimentalist. So he examines chimpanzees in captivity and basically does controlled experiments. And you think, oh, maybe this is the proper way of doing science. Within the people who work on this area, I think there's sort of some tension between those who do experimental work, normally in zoos, and those who do more ethnographic studies, where they go out and they observe chimpanzees in their natural habitat. So I think some people think some people think that the chimpanzees are capable of doing more than what Tommasello thinks, and the way to discover this is by observing them in their natural environment rather than by doing controlled experiments. Yeah, because controlled experiments are not a good way of discovering sort of natural capacities. So I think there's a sort of split amongst the people who who work in primatology. And one thing is that in terms of publishing, I mean, if you want a career, you're much better off doing controlled experiments in zoos than doing long-term observational studies. Yeah, because if you want a job, you need to be publishing every couple of years. And if your study takes 10 years, you're not going to get the job. Whereas if you could go into a zoo and you could do a very quick studies. So I think there's sort of institutional pressures that have sort of pushed. Yeah. Anyway, but I really like Tommasello. So I think that his work has been very influential. Both, I think, within psychology, within primatology, within developmental psychology, and I think amongst philosophers, I think people are interested in him. I've got a paper on Tommasello and Kant. If anyone's interested, I can send it. If anyone likes Kant and you like Tommasello, so Tommasello starts off this paper. Tommasello and Henrika Moll start off this paper by comparing these two approaches, the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis and the Vysotskian intelligence hypothesis. So what's this sort of setup between these two stories? And Tommasello thinks that both parties are right. So what's the story in the introduction? Or are people in places where they can talk?
I think I can try.
Okay.
The Vysotskian hypothesis emphasizes the cooperation, I think, of communities, animal communities.
Mm-hmm.
On the contrary, Machiavellian hypothesis emphasizes the competition between them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the story basically.
Yeah, and so you had these two things developing at the same time. Intelligence is Machiavellian, it's all that comes out of competition, or intelligence is all about cooperation, it's all about doing stuff cooperatively together. How can they both be right? And Tommasello's story is, well, both stories are right because they're about different populations. So when it comes to most of the great apes, they're basically competitive animals. And if we're studying chimpanzees, basically the sort of social intelligence is in terms of competition. Humans have sort of evolved to be cooperative though. So human intelligence and chimpanzee intelligence, there's a sort of radical break between us and other primates. And the big radical break has got to do with the fact that we're cooperative. Yeah, so cooperation is really, if we're interested in the question of what makes us human, you know, if you've got this Aristotelian idea, Aristotle, you know, like for any species, there's going to be a specific difference. There's something that distinguishes us from all the other primates. What is it? And Tommasello thinks that the big thing, the big step in evolution was the emergence of cooperation. And I think this is a picture that is people are. It's a fairly common story now. I think this has become a very popular position. One sort of question is, well, how did this come about? And he speculates towards the end, and the sort of suggestion is that human beings have somehow self-domesticated. And I think this, once again, this notion of self-domestication is something that a bunch of people have bought into. There's interesting work. Has anyone read any work on domestication? So you've got the Soviet study who were domesticating wild foxes. Do people know about this study? They basically, very interesting. What they did is they just selected against aggression. So they had a bunch of these wild foxes and they just killed the most aggressive ones and then let the rest breed. And within a human lifetime, they'd actually gone from wild foxes to things that are much more like dogs. And they posited that with domestication, there's a whole syndrome. Just by selecting for this one thing against aggression, you end up with a whole bunch of other things that come with it, including kind of some move towards being more cooperative with human beings. Yeah. Now, of course, with foxes, we're doing the domesticating. How does self-domestication work? Tommasello himself doesn't tell much of a story. There's one guy who I think is quite fun if you like these sort of scientific evolutionary just so stories. There's this guy called Richard Wrangham. People know him. He's got a book called The Goodness Paradox. So he's got the idea that human self-domestication came with the sort of beta males killing the alpha males. So you had kind of coalitions of the of non-alpha males who basically killed off anyone who was too aggressive. Some people compare us with bonobos, the sort of sex monkeys, the sex apes. These are like chimps, but they, instead of fighting, they screw a lot. Yeah, they just kind of, when they get into these kind of tensions, they sort of make up by cooking up. I mean, people say, oh, they're kind of friendly and sexy. I mean, they're still really vicious chimpanzees, kind of like apes. They're not cooperative like humans, but they're a bit close. Out of all of the apes, they tend to be the least aggressive ones. But they've sort of moved in this way by being sort of matrilineal and by women, coalitions of women working against the alpha men. Wrangham's story is that with humans, it was the coalitions of beta males fighting the chads. I don't know. It's something like that. But this is but yeah, if you're interested in how this could have come about, I think one of the things interesting about Tommasello is he thinks that this is the big move into the emergence of language. So the big thing about the big step in the evolution of language wasn't so much kind of all of the syntax stuff. That sort of comes quite easily, and the capacity for recursion. I think he thinks, well, that's not so big, and maybe it's not even that central to language. The big thing in the emergence of language was the emergence of cooperation, and linguistic communication is a form of cooperative activity, and in order to understand, in order to become a language using animal, you've got to understand something like communicative intentions. And a communicative intention is essentially helpful if someone's trying to communicate something to you. Yeah. And so, yeah, so in terms of his sort of understanding of language, I think his big influences are Wittgenstein and also a guy called Grice. I don't know if people know about Grice. He's another philosopher who played a big role in the foundation of linguistics. Who's in linguistics here? Yeah, so have you heard of Nihal? Have you heard of Grice? He kind of came out with this idea of conversational implicature. So you might have heard of Gricean implicature. So you've got the you've got Grice's maxims of sort of pragmatics, I guess. But you've also got this idea that you've got what the sentence means, but then you've got the sort of implicature, and that involves some. But to get the implicature, to get what's implied, you need some sort of shared context. So I think one of the things that we're going to see in at the end of this paper is he sort of introduces some of his ideas about language. And one of his ideas of language is that in order to communicate linguistically, one of the kind of preconditions for linguistic communication is going to be what he calls a joint attentional frames. Yeah, you need some sort of common shared knowledge. You have to understand the sort of that there's a sort of when me and you communicate, that in some sense in order for this communication to be possible, this presupposes some sort of joint frame of reference. And he thinks that we can only really get this if we're capable of joint attention. So I think that one of the big moves is move towards cooperation and the development of joint attention. So he looks at apes, he looks at chimpanzees. In the second section, he talks about a bunch of early studies where they did a bunch of experiments with chimps. And as a result of these experiments, they thought, my God, chimps are really stupid. Yeah, so, and the idea was that these early experiments made it appear as if chimps didn't really have any sort of understanding of the mindedness of other chimps. Yeah. So, for example, do chimps know what other chimps can see? Yeah. Do they understand the idea that about other chimps are able to see the world? And I think it was Povinelli did an experiment. Do you know this? Remember this experiment, the gesture choice experiment? So the chimp wants you to do something, and it learns it can point, and you'll do it. Now, you put a bucket on your head so you can't see the chimp. The chimp will still point. So you might think, well, and you put a bucket on your shoulder. Now, another human being will, if you've got a bucket on your head, they're going to think, well, you can't see. It's not worth pointing. So these experimenters, they did a bunch of experiments like this that seem to suggest chimps just didn't have any understanding of the fact that other chimps or other subjects saw things. They didn't have an understanding that other chimps saw things. What's Tommasello's problem with these experiments? I think Tommasello here won this argument, and everyone agrees with Tommasello, I think, about this, because he said, hold on a minute, that the problem with chimps isn't that they don't have any grasp that other chimps can see things. Yeah, so this is on page Great Ape Social Commit. Oh, this is on page 640. Concluding from these experiments, concluding from chimps' failures in these two experiments paradigms that they do not understand seeing would be more premature. Yeah, and more recent studies have shown that in the right situation, chimps can use the gaze direction of others to make effective foraging choices. Yeah, they do not do this, however, not when the conspecific is attempting to be cooperative, but rather when the conspecific is attempting to compete with them. So in potentially cooperative situations where it's important to know what the other person can see, chimps just are useless. But when it comes to when you're in a competitive situation, so if like Hasnan and Yunus are attempting to find food, yeah, and I don't know who's the alpha. I don't know. Hassan's at the top. So Hassan is the alpha. Yunus is only going to take food that he can see that Hasnan can't see. Yeah. So when it comes to getting food, chimps are very good at keeping track of what the alpha male can see, because you only take a banana if the alpha male can't see it. Yeah. If you're hiding a banana, you'll go and hide it somewhere where the alpha male can't see it. If you're going to retrieve a banana, you'll only retrieve it from somewhere that the alpha male can't see. If you're going to hook up with one of the girls, you do it off behind a tree where the alpha, so chimps, it turns out, are quite good at keeping track of what other chimps can see. The reason they failed on the tests isn't because they aren't able to keep track of what other chimps can see. It's just that they only care about this in competitive situations. And why is that? Well, the reason for that is that chimps are just not very cooperative. Chimps in zoos are a bit weird because chimps in zoos are interacting with cooperative animals, us. Yeah, so they learn that in some sense we can be cooperative with them, and they can learn certain things that involve cooperation from us. But chimps together are just in general they're not particularly cooperative. So Tommasello sort of and his team kind of worked out this. Well, humans are cooperative, chimps aren't. So how can we study this in a more rigorous way. So what, and so one sort of thought is, well, we need to kind of have a more clearly defined notion of what a cooperative activity is. Yeah. And it turns out that this is something that philosophers have been talking about for some time. Yeah, so there's been a literature in philosophy from the 1980s, especially the 1990s, on cooperation and on joint cooperative activities. And a bunch of philosophers were trying to work out, coming up with a sort of definitions of what is it to do something together. And so the people doing this, you've got Bratman, you've got Searle, you've got Gilbert, yeah, and sorry, I need my selector. And so he said that in previous work, we're going to use a modified version of Bratman's definition. So Bratman gives a definition of what's involved in shared cooperative activities. Now, as I mentioned before, Bratman, Margaret Gilbert, John Searle, they're trying to give a definition of this common sense term. And then what they're trying to do is then ask themselves, is it a good definition? In some sense, I think Tommasello doesn't have to worry so much about that. I think he can just stipulate. Yeah, like I think this is the idea. Well, I was going to give you a definition of what I call a shared cooperative activity. And I'm going to stipulate this is sort of what's required to be able to do this. And I don't really care if it matches up with our common sense notion of doing something together, even though probably it does. Yeah, that's what the philosophers are interested in. I'm interested in defining it, and then we can use it as a way of kind of, we can then ask whether certain animals are capable of engaging in it. So you can think of this definition as a kind of old school analytic philosophy definition, which you might think of as a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. To engage in joint cooperative activity, you need to satisfy each one of them. So each one of them is necessary. And if you satisfy all three of them, then you're engaging in a joint cooperative activity. Yeah, so first, the participants in the cooperative activity share a joint goal to which they are jointly committed. So you have this idea of having a joint goal to which they are jointly committed. Yeah, so I think this definition involves a lot. Yeah, so because it's not enough to each of us have the same goal. Yeah, the goal's got to be shared. So like if I am going to the pub and you're going to the pub, we've both got the same goal, but it's not necessarily a shared goal. Yeah, I've got the goal and you've got the goal, but we haven't got the goal of going to the pub because we haven't talked about it. I don't know you're going to the pub, you don't know I'm going. So I think you might think a shared goal is one thing. And I think very important here is that you have some notion of joint commitment. Yeah, so and I think this notion of commitment turns out to be doing a lot of work. So to have a joint commitment involves, I think this makes it a sort of normative notion. Yeah, so that if we have a shared goal, this means that we have a joint commitment. And then if you don't do your part, yeah, you're sort of violating the commitment. Yeah, so that having a shared, this having a shared goal to which they're jointly committed, I think he's building in a lot here. I think maybe he should have separated off the notion of having a shared goal from the notion of joint commitment. Yeah, it seems you could share a goal, but without really being committed to it, for example, not obvious. Okay, secondly, and relatedly, the participants take reciprocal or complementary roles in order to achieve the goal. Yeah, and I think he thinks that ideally, when you engage in such an activity, you have some sort of understanding of the roles involved. So one has what he could later call some sort of bird's eye view of it. And the participants are generally motivated and willing to help one another accomplish their role if needed. So there's some sort of criterion of sort of mutual support. Now, if you're interested, you can read Bratman and Gilbert about how they came up with all of these things into their definitions. But we can just, from the scientific, as a sort of experiment, if you're into the experimental side, you can just take this as a given, and then you can just ask, okay, let's check whether an activity is like this. Now, who likes watching nature documentaries? Yeah, so if you like watching nature documentaries, like, have you seen the dolphins hunting together? There's some good ones. So now have a look on YouTube of kind of dolphins, and it looks like you've got a group of dolphins that are cooperating. Yeah, that one of the dolphins goes around in a circle, and all the fish get kind of sucked in, and then the other dolphins jump through it. And with chimps, so one thing about chimpanzees is you might ask, well, are chimps capable of cooperative activity? And if you observe chimps in the wild, you go and look at them, and you might be like, well, yeah, hunting. Think about chimpanzee hunting. And so who read this? How does a chimpanzee hunt work? Anyone? So there's a bunch of studies by Bosch, I don't know how to pronounce it, Bosch Ackerman. Okay. Yeah, so you have chimpanzees hunting groups, but they hunt little monkeys. So you have the chimpanzees, they have these little monkeys, and one individual. So in the account of these researchers, the animals take complementary roles in their hunting. Yeah. So one individual called the driver chases the prey in certain directions. So you have one animal, while others, the so-called blockers, climb the trees and prevent the prey from changing directions. So you have the guy chasing, you have these chimpanzees in the trees, the guy is forced just to run ahead, and an ambusher creeps through the undergrowth and then silently moves in front of the prey, making an escape impossible. Yeah, so it looks like, if you look at this from the outside, you've got something like a division of labor, yeah, with different chimpanzees taking on different roles to succeed in the hunt. And you might think, well, of course, when the hunting event is described with this vocabulary of complementary roles, then it appears to be a joint cooperative activity. You might think complementary roles already implies that there is a joint goal shared by the role takers. So one thing is just looking at chimpanzee behavior, we might think, isn't it obvious that they're engaged in some sort of joint cooperative activity? They're hunting together. Look at these dolphin videos. Now, it's not clear. Dolphins may be more cooperative than chimps. It's not obvious, but I mean, so what does Tommasello say about this case? Is this a real case of cooperative activity? Well, he says no. So this isn't a cooperative activity in the strong sense that I'm using the term. Yep. He says a more plausible characterization of the hunting event from our perspective is as follows. Each animal feels whatever spatial position is still available at any given time, so that the encircling is accomplished in a stepwise fashion, without any kind of prior plan or agreement to a shared goal or assignment of roles. Then, without pursuing a joint goal or accomplishing a certain role within a higher order framework, each individual chases the prey from its own position. Now, this event clearly is a group activity or group action. Yeah, so there is something social about this. There is not denying some form of sociality. The chimps are mutually responsive as they coordinate their behaviors with that of others in space and time. Yeah, so you've got some basic form of mutual responsiveness. Yeah, that but what seems to be missing is the togetherness or jointness that distinguishes shared cooperative activities from other types of group action. So each chimp is moderating its behavior based upon the behavior of others. So we've got this, so the sort of, there is group behavior that maybe can't be understood purely from the individualistic perspective. But it's not going to be cooperative in this strong sense that we've defined. And we could just say, let's take this strong sense stipulatively. Yeah, I'm going to stipulate this is what I mean by cooperative activity. Now, this interpretation is strongly supported by studies that have investigated chimps' abilities to cooperate in experimental settings. So I take it that we don't really know. I mean, it's difficult to do an intervention on a chimp hunt. Yeah, so when chimps are hunting, so one thing you'd want to know is if one chimp stops playing their role, do the other chimps complain? Yeah, is there this idea that that one chimp is failing to do their work? And I take it the sort of answer is no. So one sort of type of experimentation is to engage in some activity together and then have interruption periods. So you're doing something with a chimp and then you suddenly stop doing it. Now, if you do that with a 1-year-old child, what happens? If you're playing with a 1-year-old child and then suddenly for no reason you stop, what's the 1-year-old going to say? They're going to complain. Maybe a 1.5-year-old. Yeah, a young child, if you're engaged in doing something together and you stop, they protest. Yeah, and this protest, I take it, is an indication of this first thing. Yeah, the fact of protest entails some sort of joint commitment. So the child, in some sense, protests because this is something we're doing together and we're both committed to it. With chimpanzees, though, the results are unlike with humans. Yeah, so the results were very consistent. In the problem-solving tasks, okay, yeah. So chimps can coordinate when they need to do something together to get food. But most importantly was what happened when the humans suddenly interrupted the activity. In none of the tasks did a chimp ever make a communicative attempt to re-engage the partner. Yeah, so you might think that if you're doing something together and you're jointly committed, and then one side kind of pulls out a bit, the other party is going to complain. This is how joint activities work. Yeah. Such attempts were missing, even in the case where they should have been highly motivated to obtain the desired results, as in the problem-solving task involved. Yeah, the absence of any effort by the chimpanzees to re-engage their human partner is crucial. It shows that the chimpanzees did not cooperate in the true sense, since they had not formed a joint goal with the human. Yeah. If they'd been committed to a joint goal, then we would expect them, at least in some instances, to persist in trying to bring it about and in trying to keep the cooperation going. So if you're committed to a joint goal, you're committed to keeping the cooperation going, which means that if one of the parties pulls out. Now, with children, it's very different. So children cooperate not only in problem-solving tasks, in social games, and most importantly, when the adults stop participating at a certain point during the activity, every child at least once produced a communicative attempt in order to re-engage him. Yeah. In some cases, the children grabbed the adult by his arm and drew them to the apparatus. Yeah. And I take it we might think that there's some sort of this notion of commitment. We might think it's very much it's the emergence of some sort of basic normativity. This commitment is that if you're doing something together, the other party ought to play their part of the role. There's some sort of basic sort of normativity here that is in play. Yeah. So, and one of the things Tommasello's group has also been involved in, and this is an interesting area of research, especially philosophy. I mean, if you're a philosopher, say you're interested in Wittgenstein, I know some of you, one of the things Tommasello has worked on is on games and the sort of normativity of games and the emergence of normativity in young children. And so from very early on, the children have some idea of what you're supposed to do. For example, in one of the games, they always use a can in order to catch a toy when it came falling out of one end of the tube. They could have taught it with their hand, but they preferred to do it the way it had been demonstrated to them. And so it implies that they perceived the can as a constitutive element of the game, and they wanted to play the game the way it ought to be played. Yeah. So children have some sort of normative side to things. So I take it that I mean, here, I think Tommasello could be a little bit clearer about what his commitments are. But I take it the thought is that having a joint goal is tied to some notion of basic normativity. There's a basic type of social normativity here, some sort of ought that humans have and chimps don't. Yeah. Now, the second criteria is role taking. So, and he's got some interesting things to say about this. They did some, and he looks at some experimental work to suggest that. So he says this form of role taking would suggest that each partner represents the entire collaboration, its shared goal and reciprocal roles holistically from a bird's eye view, instead of just from within whatever role they happen to be taking at the moment. And so one sort of evidence of this capacity to understand things from this bird's eye point of view is understanding these roles has got to do with the degree one can learn an activity by playing one role and then come back and play the other role. So if you're taught a game that has two roles and then the other role is thrust upon you, does your understanding of the activity, is the understanding of the activity such that being taught to play one role, you can switch into the other role? And you've got some simple games like this, where children, very young children, are able to switch roles and understand these different types of roles in a way that chimpanzees don't seem to be able to do. And once again, that you might think the notion of a role is also something that has a certain type of normativity to it. Yeah, because you've got this activity, you've got these two different roles, and if you play this role, this is what you should do. If you play this role, this is how you do it. Yeah, these, you know, that you might think that the notion of roles might be tied to some notion of rules or to some, yeah, yeah. So, and finally, in terms of helping, so, and in general, the sort of idea is that chimps aren't very helpful. They're sometimes, if it doesn't cost them very much, yeah, a little bit of helpfulness. But in general, that chimps only help in limited situations. Young children are helpful right from the beginning. So yeah, infants as young as 18 months help from the very beginning. So the sort of suggestion is that the chimpanzees lack a capacity for we intentionality. Yeah, of a kind of we perspective. Now, so we've talked a bit about cooperative activity. I think one of the things that Tommasello is most famous for is his work on cooperative communication. So if you find this interesting, he's got a nice, very readable book that it's a sort of book you can read on the beach, called The Origin of Human Communication. So it looks at how communication works. It's sort of very nice. And one of the things, yeah, he's best known for is his work on pointing. So chimps are capable of having some meaningful gestures. So one of the things that he argues for in this book is that language developed out of ape gestures. And so they have a bunch of meaningful gestures. So there's a sort of come and play with me. So you have this arm raise, which is a kind of gesture that is sort of inviting play. Hey, come and play with me. You have a request for nursing. Yeah, so chimps, if they've got some injury and they want another chimp to come and lick them, or to, yeah, they can touch their side, and the other chimp will come and these gestures do seem to be kind of communicative. There's a communicative intention there. So Grice in his very influential article from the 50s called Meaning kind of suggests that central to meaning is the communicative intention, and that understanding a meaning is, in some sense, to understand what someone means, the speaker's meaning is to understand what they're intending to communicate. Yeah, and so the chimps do have some basic communicative intentions. They want to play, and they do something that's intended to communicate that they want to play. They want to be nursed. But what they don't engage in is pointing activity. Yeah, so pointing is something that is very central. So pointing is a gesture, and it's a communicative gesture that has, when you point, you intend to communicate something. You want the other person to look at where you're pointing for various reasons. And you might think that for the development of any sort of sophisticated language, pointing is going to be central, because pointing is going to be tied to reference. So in order to develop a language with reference, reference has its basis in something like pointing. So if we want to look at the emergence of language, we have to look at, one of the things we're going to have to look at is the emergence of pointing. Yeah, so, you know, when it comes to language, if you're a kind of Chomskyan, the central thing in language is syntax and the emergence of syntax. I take it that for someone like Tommasello, the big thing in language is semantics. How does semantics work? And once you've got the semantics, syntax can sort of emerge from the semantics. And I think this is sort of the sort of alternative view of syntax. Is that you start off with content, and then you get something like dramatization of the semantic stuff. This is my sort of, I'm sympathetic to something like this. Yeah. So you might think that when you're thinking about the emergence of language, Chomskyans think, oh, the big problem is to understand the emergence of syntax. think the other view is no. The really big thing is to understand the emergence of semantics and how is reference possible. If you think that's a big problem, then the emergence of pointing is going to play a quite central role. How is pointing? When does pointing emerge? And it turns out that this stuff on pointing is so in this section, it turns out that in nature, chimps have never been observed to point in the wild. Yeah. Now, I have read thing that contests this. This article is like 13 years old. Maybe there are some people out there saying no, chimps do point. But as I'm aware, yeah, I mean, I think this is fairly well agreed. That in captivity as well, chimps don't point. Well, in captivity, chimps can learn how to point, but they only learn to with human beings, and they learn to point in such a way that they use pointing as a way of getting human beings to do things for them. Yeah. So and so this is a passage I like. For those of you who are from philosophy, that you might think that Kant has this idea of Kantian ethics involves treating others as ends, not merely as means. Yeah, so we have this idea of Kantian respect, and it looks like chimps are not really capable of Kantian respect. Yeah, so he says it seems that what the apes have learned from their experience with humans is that the human will help them, and that they can use the pointing gesture instrumentally in order to make him help them. Thus, they use the human as a social tool in order to get things they could not otherwise get. And they have learned that pointing gets this tool to work. So chimps basically use pointing as a way of treating humans as sort of social tools. Yes, and pointing is a way of getting the human to do what you want. It turns out, though, that humans, babies, point right from the time they've got good control over their hands, and they don't just point to get things that they want, but they point in order to sculpt the attention of the other. So that pointing is used as a way of, and very often babies point at things that their mother or father want. And they'll point to things because they think they're funny and they want the parent to look and to share attention. So infant pointing is really different from chimpanzee pointing. Yeah, and this is really central to the difference between infants and humans. Now, it's now the end of this class. Now, next class, I was hoping to kind of jump into Millikan. You can read this yourself. Or what do you think? Should I spend the first hour finishing off Tommasello, or should I just be like, okay, you can read Tommasello, let's talk about Milligan? Any preferences?
I think we should talk about Millikan, and we can skip Tommasello, but I don't know what others think of
it. Anyone else? Okay. So I mean, I've told you the stuff I sort of, okay. So my guess is Tommasello, if you're in, say, psychology, Tommasello you've probably come across before. I think Milligan is fun and important. And so Tommasello's a psychologist. Milligan's a philosopher. And I think for non-philosophers especially, Milligan's a bit harder than Tommasello. So Tommasello, I think you can read by yourself. Yeah, okay, so tomorrow, if you've got any questions about Tommasello, then fire away. I think so one of the central things is in here we've got the evidence of pointing, on page 644, yeah, he introduces this idea of a joint attentional frame. Yeah, and so in order to understand communicative attentions, we need some sort of capacity for joint attention. He has an interesting kind of discussion about why that's important. You need some sort of joint attentional frame. And yeah, and infants seem capable of these sort of joint attentional frames from 14 months. So I think these experiments here. So I mean, you can be engaging a game with a 14-month child, and you can have one game can involve putting objects into a box, tidying up. Another one can involve something like stacking, and you've got the same objects, and that within one frame, that the task is to stack. And children are quite capable of understanding which frame they're in and switching from one to the other. And if someone comes in who isn't playing that game, then they're not in the same joint attentional frame. Yeah, and young infants can do this. So the sort of thought is that if you're interested in language, in the emergence of language, you should be interested in pointing. And pointing kind of works as a kind of, in this communicative way, presupposes some sort of capacity for joint attention. And then you might think, really, what really differentiates us then from other chimps, other apes, is this, well, there's a change in motivation to being helpful. And then in terms of cognitive changes, you might think that the capacity for joint attention is going to be, yeah. But I think in general, Tommasello thinks that the big change between other apes and us is not primarily cognitive, but motivational. Yeah, it's this move towards being more cooperative, being more helpful, and the cognitive change is relatively minor. These are not the kind of the major driving forces. Okay, so I think Tommasello's fun. If you've read him before, is a little reminder. If you haven't read him before, he's fun to read. I gave you a sort of longer on talking about joint attentional frames.
Yeah, this guy is waiting.
What? It's Daddy.
I think he just woke up.
He just woke up.
I mean,
Okay, Zubede needs the computer because she's teaching in about 5 minutes. What? And he's just learned to roll over. Isn't that cute? Oh, Daddy, I love you. I love you. Okay, bye-bye. Oops.